Usually, when you set out to achieve some massive, like, life-altering goal, there is this expectation of a finish line.
Right, a clear endpoint.
Exactly. Think about climbing a mountain. You endure the freezing cold, your muscles are just screaming, you pull yourself up that final brutal ridge.
And you plant your flag.
Yeah. You plant your flag at the summit, and you just stop. You're done. You're at the top, looking down at where you used to be. It's clean, it's measurable, and, I mean, it is incredibly satisfying to the human brain.
We definitely crave that linearity. We desperately want to know we are moving from a state of being flawed or trapped or ignorant toward a state of being perfect, free, and wise.
But then you step into the world of Mahayana philosophy, specifically the teachings of this incredibly brilliant, slightly terrifying 2nd century thinker named Nāgārjuna.
He is definitely a force to be reckoned with.
Oh, for sure. And he looks at that mountain, and he essentially says, the summit doesn't exist. The climber doesn't exist. The mountain itself is a complete illusion.
Which is a lot to process.
It really is. So today, we are bringing in the demolition crew. We are taking the final chapters of Nāgārjuna's masterwork, the Mūlamadhyamakakārikā, specifically chapters 22 through 27.
And we have a great source for this.
We do. We are using a brilliant synthesis document titled Reflections on Chapters 22 through 27 to just completely dismantle the machinery of spiritual progression.
Which, I should warn you, is going to be pretty uncomfortable.
Yeah, fair warning.
Nāgārjuna doesn't just ask you to change what you think about reality. He actually attacks the very mechanisms you use to think in the first place. We are going to apply this universal solvent to dissolve conceptual grasping.
But we aren't doing this just to exchange one philosophical belief system for another, right?
Exactly. We aren't tearing down your old stressful house just to build a slightly nicer, more, quote-unquote spiritual house on the exact same shaky foundation.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if you've been with us on previous deep dives into this material, we've looked at how Nāgārjuna deconstructs mechanics like time and motion.
Right, the physics of it.
Yeah. But today is entirely about the goal. We are tackling the heavy-hitting dualities. Pure versus impure, bondage versus liberation, saṃsāra, which is the cycle of suffering, versus nirvāṇa.
And the ordinary flawed being versus the fully enlightened one.
Yes. And according to our source, before we can even begin to understand what liberation actually is, we have to look at the architecture of our suffering. The text argues this starts with how our minds compulsively chop up reality.
The source identifies this as the trap of the 3 spheres, or triads.
Triads, okay.
Yeah. The human mind just cannot seem to tolerate a seamless, interdependent cosmos. To make sense of things, our cognition acts like this frantic butcher.
A frantic butcher, I like that.
Right. It artificially slices experience into distinct, isolated chunks. You get a subject, an action, and an object.
Okay, so I'm looking at my desk right now. I see my coffee cup, my microphone, my notebook. It all feels pretty distinct to me. How exactly is my brain, chopping this up artificially?
Let's use the concept of ownership, which is a really classic triad. When you look at that coffee cup and think, my coffee, your mind instantaneously projects 3 distinct spheres.
I'm tracking.
First, there is the owner, that's you, an independent subject. Second, there is the acquired possession, which is the cup of coffee, an independent object.
And the third?
The third is the invisible conceptual relationship of ownership acting as a bridge between the two.
I mean, that just seems like basic grammar. Subject, verb, object.
Yeah.
It's how we navigate a Tuesday.
Oh, it's highly functional for navigating a Tuesday. The problem isn't that we use these categories to speak or to organize our desks.
So what's the issue?
The cognitive error, which is the root of human suffering, according to Nāgārjuna, is that we assume these conceptual boundaries reflect an inherent objective territory out there in the physical world.
Ah, see.
We start to believe the universe is actually built out of these isolated, self-contained building blocks that just happen to bump into each other. We reify them.
So we think the categories we invented are actually baked into the atoms of the universe.
Yes. And we do this on a grand spiritual scale, too.
How so?
Well, we project a starting point, which is saṃsāra, the world of suffering. We project a path of practice. And we project a final destination, nirvāṇa.
Subject, path, goal.
Exactly.
Wait, if the building blocks of the universe aren't solid, why doesn't everything just collapse? I mean, how does Nāgārjuna prove these boundaries are fake? Because, again, when I pick up the coffee cup, my hand feels the ceramic. It feels pretty inherently real.
He proves it using this relentless logical tool called the tetralemma.
The four-cornered logic.
Right. It's designed to exhaust every single ontological possibility of how two things can relate to each other. The text walks us through an intense 11-step analytical reasoning process.
Which is a lot to get through.
It is, but the core of it is the tetralemma. Let's apply it to the biggest assumed boundary of all, the self.
Or what the text sometimes calls the tathagata in the context of an enlightened being, right?
Yes. The self and the aggregates, which are your physical body and your mental states.
Okay, let's put me through the four corners. Corner one. The self and the aggregates are identical.
Okay, so if the core you is inherently completely identical to your physical body and your fleeting mental states, we run into an immediate logical wall.
Because they change.
Exactly. Your aggregates are constantly changing. Cells die. Your mood shifts from happy to sad. You age.
Right.
So if the self is identical to those aggregates, then every time your body changes even slightly, your core self is entirely destroyed and a brand new self is born.
Because if I am exactly defined by my physical state at 10 a.m., then by 10:01 a.m., when my stomach growls or a cell divides.
That 10 a.m. you doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, that breaks down quickly because I obviously remember being the 10 a.m. me. There has to be continuity.
Continuity would be absolutely impossible. The progression of causality, karma, or any kind of spiritual transformation requires a thread.
Right.
If you are dying and being reborn every millisecond in totally isolated frames, spiritual progress is just a meaningless concept.
All right, so they can't be identical. Corner two.
Yeah.
The self and the aggregates are entirely different.
So if the self is an inherently separate, independent entity floating completely apart from the body and mind, the connection shatters.
Like a ghost.
Exactly. You've created a ghost in the machine that has 0 points of contact with physical reality.
I see where that fails.
Yeah.
I mean, if my soul or myself is totally separate, then when I accidentally touch a hot stove, why does the self feel pain?
It shouldn't.
Right. The physical burn shouldn't affect a completely detached spiritual entity.
Furthermore, your spiritual intentions couldn't direct your physical body to move. Any random effect could arise from any cause.
Wow. So I could think about walking and my arm would just flail around.
Basically. You could eat a highly nutritious meal, and because the physical nourishment has absolutely no connection to your isolated self, you could starve to death.
The two realms would be logically sealed off from one another.
Completely sealed off.
Okay, so they can't be identical, and they can't be completely separate. Corner three. They're both identical and different.
Which is just blatant violation of the law of non-contradiction.
Yeah, that makes no sense.
You cannot mash two failed arguments together and expect them to suddenly produce a logically sound framework.
It's like saying a shape is a square circle. It's just noise.
Exactly.
Which brings us to corner four, the one that always trips me up. The self and the aggregates are neither identical nor different.
This is where Nāgārjuna gets incredibly precise. Because a lot of ancient Indian philosophers tried to use this fourth corner as an escape hatch.
Oh, really?
Yeah. When they realized they couldn't logically prove the self was identical or different, they would claim the true self is simply inexpressible.
Like it's beyond words.
Right. They'd say it exists inherently, but it exists in a mystical state of neither nor that is beyond human logic.
I mean, that actually sounds pretty appealing. It sounds deep. Like, my true nature cannot be spoken.
It sounds deep, sure. But Nāgārjuna argues it is a meaningless semantic evasion.
A cop-out.
It's a total philosophical cop-out. If a concept is not identical, not different, and not both, declaring it to be neither provides absolutely no operational framework.
It's just a trick.
Yes, a linguistic trick to protect a reified concept that has already failed the first 3 tests. You are still clinging to the idea that there is an inherent independent self hiding somewhere.
You've just put it behind a curtain of mystery.
Exactly, and Nāgārjuna slams that door shut. All 4 corners fail.
So, if the self cannot be found in any of the 4 corners, then the independent, isolated self does not exist. The boundary is an illusion.
The boundary is an illusion. And if you apply this to existence and non-existence, you find the exact same collapse.
How does that work?
Well, the source notes that assuming inherent existence demands an unchangeable, unconditioned stasis. A frozen universe.
Like the seed that can never grow.
Right, but assuming absolute non-existence plunges us into paralyzing nihilism where nothing is real and nothing matters. Both extremes fail completely.
I want to try an analogy here to see if I'm grasping the collapse of these boundaries.
Let's hear it.
Imagine you have an incredibly detailed, ancient map of the world's oceans. You have the Pacific Ocean colored bright blue, the Indian Ocean colored green, and there is a thick, black, dashed line drawn right down the middle separating them.
Okay, a map.
Now, if you are a sea captain, you absolutely need those categories to navigate, to communicate with other ships, to survive. But if you put on scuba gear and dive into the water at that exact coordinate,
You aren't going to bump into a line.
Exactly. You won't bump into a giant dashed black line floating in the water. The water doesn't know it's the Pacific or the Indian Ocean. It's just one continuous fluid oneness.
I see where you're going with the dashed lines representing conceptual boundaries. However, Nāgārjuna would actually take serious issue with the end of your analogy.
He would, the continuous fluid oneness part.
Yes.
But isn't that the whole point? The boundaries are fake, so underneath it all, everything is just one big cosmic soup.
That is perhaps the most common misunderstanding of Mahayana philosophy, and the source document explicitly warns against it. Yes, if you declare the boundaries are fake, therefore the universe is a single undifferentiated oneness, you have just created another extreme.
Yeah.
You've taken the grasping, reifying ego and inflated it to a cosmic scale.
Oh, wow. I just drew a really, really big sphere. I made the universe into one giant object.
Precisely. Monism, the idea that all is one, erases the functional, beautiful diversity of reality.
Because it just flattens everything.
Right. A forest is not just one uniform blob. It is millions of distinct yet interdependent trees, fungi, insects, and soil microbes. The map is not the territory, but that doesn't mean the territory is a featureless void of oneness.
Man, this is incredibly disorienting. If the boundaries aren't real, if the spheres of subject, path, and destination are just dashed lines, then what actually is the territory?
According to the text, because all these spheres fail the tetralemma, they possess what is called sunyata, which is emptiness.
Emptiness.
Specifically, they have emptiness of inherent existence. They lack an independent, self-sustaining core.
And this brings us right to the edge of an incredibly dangerous philosophical cliff. Because when the human mind hears everything is empty, it immediately tries to turn emptiness into a physical thing.
Yes, the source issues an ultimate warning here. Emptiness is not a cosmic void.
It's not a black hole.
No, it is not a giant black hole sucking up reality, nor is it a new foundational ground of being or a mystical energy field that everything is made out of.
The text literally states emptiness itself is empty.
Exactly. To reify emptiness, to make it solid, to treat it as an absolute truth or a transcendental realm that you can magically visit through meditation, is to fall into the deepest trap of all.
It's like realizing that your everyday life, your stress, your ego, your desires is a trap. Let's call it a rusty iron cage of everyday suffering.
A rusty iron cage? Sure.
It hurts. It's limiting. So you study Nāgārjuna, you meditate, you learn about emptiness, and you think, aha, emptiness is the ultimate truth. I will detach from everything and worship the void.
And what happens?
All you have done is swap out that rusty iron cage for a brand new cage made of pure, sparkling, enlightened gold.
That is the perfect visualization of the trap.
Right. It might feel vastly superior. You might look incredibly serene to all your friends, but you are still entirely trapped in a conceptual prison. You just traded one absolute for another.
That golden cage is exactly what happens when you replace a universe of solid objects with an equally rigid, idolized void. You are still grasping. You just change the label on the thing you are grasping at.
But if reality isn't solid objects, and it isn't a solid void, and it isn't a giant blob of oneness, I mean, how does anything exist at all? How are we even having this conversation?
This is where the framework introduces the ultimate antidote to both the iron cage and the golden cage. Pratitya-samutpada.
Dependent origination.
Yes, because phenomena completely lack an isolated, independent essence. They can only exist as inseparable, dependently co-arisen processes. Everything exists strictly in relation to everything else.
So things don't exist independently. They exist interdependently.
Exactly. The spheres we talked about earlier, the honor, the ownership, the possession, they are mutually dependent.
You can't have an owner without a thing to own.
Right. You cannot have an owner without an owned possession. They arise together. The text says they are merely co-imputed by the mind. They are convenient designations and models we use to navigate consensual reality.
Okay, let's ground this. How does dependent origination actually work in real life? The source mentions the 12 links.
The 12 links of dependent origination outline exactly how our suffering is constructed moment by moment, completely devoid of any solid, inherent self directing the show.
Okay, walk us through it.
It starts with ignorance, which in this context is specifically the ignorance of seeing the world as made of solid, independent objects.
So my baseline assumption that my desk is just a permanent desk.
Right. That ignorance conditions formations. habitual mental reactions.
Okay.
Those formations condition consciousness. Consciousness conditions name and form, which is the way we categorize the world. This cascades down through our six senses, leading to contact with the world, which triggers feeling.
Let's slow down there. Contact triggers feeling. So let's say I look at my phone, I see a text message from a coworker criticizing my work.
A very relatable scenario.
Right. So the visual contact with the pixels on the screen triggers a negative feeling in my body.
Yes, and here is the crucial juncture. That negative feeling conditions craving. The craving to get away from the pain or the craving to strike back.
I want to fix it or fight it.
Exactly. Then craving solidifies into grasping. You latch onto the identity of being an insulted, victimized, independent self.
I become the victim.
Yes, that grasping conditions becoming, which leads to birth of a whole new state of suffering, aging, and death of that moment.
It's a total domino effect. And nowhere in that chain of 12 dominoes is there a little man inside my head called the self who is inherently real.
There is no little man.
It is just a cascade of causes and conditions.
A cascade that we mistake for solid reality. What's fascinating here is how realizing this exposes the fatal flaw of the intellect.
Which is?
Mistaking these dependently originated maps for the actual territory of reality as it is, what the text calls suchness or tathata.
Suchness.
We need the maps to live, to communicate, to build bridges. But you shouldn't go to a restaurant, read the menu, and then start chewing on the laminated cardboard, expecting it to taste like the steak.
That's hilarious. We are walking around eating the menu, completely confused as to why we have a stomachache.
Exactly. And we are fiercely defending our favorite menus, going to war over whose laminated cardboard is the absolute truth.
I love that. But I do have to push back here because there's a massive tension in this philosophy that I think a lot of listeners will feel.
Go ahead.
If everything is just a conceptual map or an empty, dependently originated process, why does my suffering feel so intensely real?
Because it is conventionally real.
But think about it. When someone is grieving the loss of a loved one, or terrified of a medical diagnosis, or trapped in the cycle of an addiction, you can't just tell them, hey, your pain is just a map. It's empty.
Right. That would be incredibly callous.
It feels dismissive. It feels like absolute crushing reality to that person.
And it is a reality, which is why Nāgārjuna's philosophy is so careful to establish the union of the two truths. This is the resolution to that exact tension.
The two truths.
Yes. We have to deeply understand that conventional truth, which is dependent origination, the world of cause and effect, the world where your grief hurts and your rent is due, and ultimate truth, which is emptiness, the lack of inherent essence, these two are not enemies.
So they aren't in a hierarchy where emptiness is the cool, true reality, and the conventional world is just a stupid illusion we need to escape.
Absolutely not. They are mutually supportive. In fact, emptiness is not the destroyer of the universe. It is the absolute precondition for it.
Wait, how does that work?
Think back to the tetralemma. If things were not empty, if they had a frozen, solid, inherent essence, they could never change.
Right, the frozen universe again.
A seed could never become a sprout because it would be inherently locked into being a seed forever. A person who is suffering could never become a person who is free.
Because they'd be permanently defined as a suffering person.
Exactly. It is precisely because phenomena lack a frozen essence that causality, karma, grief, healing, and spiritual transformation can actually function.
Because it's empty. It can move.
Yes. The source describes all elements of our perceived reality, our defilements, our virtues, the spiritual path itself, as fundamentally illusory. But we have to define illusory carefully here.
Not like a magic trick.
Right. The text compares phenomena to echoes, reflections in a mirror, dreams, or mirages.
Okay, let's take the echo. If you stand in a canyon and shout, the echo hides back. You can hear it.
A microphone can record the decibel level.
Exactly. It'd have a functional, conventional reality. But if you try to go find the source of the echo, the physical body of the sound, there's nothing there but bouncing waves of air pressure dependent on the shape of the canyon walls.
It lacks a solid, independent core. It is there, yet not there.
Wow. Understanding this allows us to fully validate human experience without getting trapped by it. Your grief is like the echo. It is functionally real, it demands care and attention, but it does not possess an immortal, independent essence that will trap you forever.
That is beautifully put.
This makes me think of the mechanics of waking up from a really vivid nightmare. Let's say you are dreaming that a terrifying, fanged monster is chasing you through a dark forest.
Okay.
In the context of the dream, that monster is an absolute objective reality. You are running for your life.
They're terrified.
Yeah. When you finally jolt awake in your bed, you realize, oh, thank God the monster wasn't real. It was a phantom created by the structural conditions of my mind.
A structural phantom.
But, and this is the crucial part that validates the conventional truth, the sweat on your forehead. That is 100% physically real.
Your racing heart.
Real. The adrenaline flooding your bloodstream. Completely real. The illusion, the phantom monster, caused a genuine, measurable biological reaction.
And according to this text, our everyday defilements, our greed, our anger, our suffering, they operate exactly the same way.
That's wild. So we are reacting to structural phantoms. Our rigid maps are reified concepts of self and other.
Yes, but the psychological and physiological pain we feel is entirely real.
Right.
That is a highly precise way to frame the union of the two truths. The suffering is real. The inherent existence of the thing causing the suffering is false.
Which raises an incredibly practical question. How do we stop the nightmare without fighting a phantom monster?
Well, if you put on a suit of armor and try to fight the phantom monster in your dream, you are just validating the delusion.
Yeah, making the monster more real.
Which is exactly what we do when we aggressively try to destroy our egos or purify our impurities. We reify the impurity in order to fight it.
We make the dirt permanent so we can wash it.
Exactly. The source tells us that to stop the nightmare, we have to dismantle the mind's addiction to something called
Prapaññāka, conceptual proliferation.
Yes. It is the uncontrollable, conditioned, dualistic chatter of the human mind.
The inner monologue that never shuts up.
Right. It is the engine that continuously generates the map and then insists the map is real. To stop Prapaññāka, we have to recognize that the true nature of reality defies all of our linguistic binaries.
All of them.
All of them. It is not this, it is not non-this. Reality is not finite, but it is also not infinite. It is not eternal, but it's not annihilated. It is neither dual, nor is it non-dual.
And there goes the mind again, wanting to land on a comfortable concept. I mean, the moment you say not dual, my brain immediately tries to set up camp in non-duality.
And that camp is just another construct, another golden cage. The ultimate territory is entirely beyond all models, all maps, and all conceptual extremes.
Okay, but I have to stop you here.
Sure.
If we can't rely on binaries like good versus bad or pure versus impure, and we can't even rely on the comforting idea of cosmic oneness, where does that actually leave us?
Well,
Because I still have to pay my rent. I still have to navigate relationships. I can't just float in a state of linguistic paralysis where nothing is anything.
you don't float. This is where we arrive at what Nāgārjuna calls the true middle way.
The middle way.
Yes, and we have to define this carefully because the middle way is highly misunderstood in popular culture. It is not a lukewarm compromise.
It's not, I'll be 50% greedy and 50% generous, and I'll call it balance.
No, not at all. It is a radical, complete transcendence of all extremes. We strictly avoid the objectivism that solidifies the world into permanent chunks. We strictly avoid the nihilism that says nothing matters. We avoid the dualism that violently separates the pure from the impure. And we avoid the monism that erases all distinction into a featureless void.
So what does that transcendence actually look like in practice?
The middle way dictates there is absolutely nothing to aggressively reject, subtract, or purify in absolute terms. And simultaneously, there is absolutely nothing to violently seek, accept, or add to your being.
Wait, here's where it gets really interesting. If there is nothing to reject and nothing to seek, what happens to the spiritual path? What happens to the grand journey from saṃsāra to nirvāṇa that we talked about at the beginning?
This is perhaps the most radical assertion in the entire Mūlamadhyamakakārikā. The text introduces the concept of abiding in suchness, or tathata.
Okay.
And Nāgārjuna asserts that there is zero ontological difference between saṃsāra and nirvāṇa. None whatsoever. They share the exact same boundless, centerless flux of existence.
I need to wrap my head around this. So, saṃsāra, the agonizing cycle of birth, death, and suffering, and nirvāṇa, the ultimate liberation. They are the exact same place. They are the same reality.
Yes. The only difference is perception.
Wow.
The text definitively redefines nirvāṇa. It is not an escape hatch to another dimension. It is not a frozen state of eternal stillness or a heaven you go to when you die.
And it isn't the violent eradication of your ego.
Exactly. Nirvāṇa is redefined as the salutary cessation of prapaññāka, the peaceful ending of our relentless dualistic conceptual proliferation.
Nirvana is just what happens when you stop eating the menu.
That's it. It is the salutary cessation of taking our maps for the territory. It is a profound transmutation of perception.
So you don't assassinate an inherently real ignorance to acquire an inherently real wisdom.
No, because both ignorance and wisdom are dependently co-arisen concepts. They are empty of inherent existence. They are just another dualistic map.
I want to try to translate this into a very grounded, real-world scenario, because the implications here are staggering. If samsara and nirvana are the same reality, just perceived differently, this means the ontological hierarchy of the universe totally collapses.
Completely collapses.
Think about a deeply stressful secular moment. Say it's a Monday morning commute. You are stuck in gridlock traffic. Someone just swerved into your lane and cut you off. You are late for a massive presentation at work. Your stress hormones are spiking. You are sweating. You are miserable.
Sounds awful.
Right. And contrast that with the most profound, serene, blissful moment of meditation on a silent retreat high up in the Himalayas at sunset.
The ultimate spiritual peak.
Yeah. We are deeply conditioned to believe that the mountain retreat is closer to truth, more pure. And the traffic jam is dirty, secular, and infinitely far away from truth.
That is the core of our dualistic conditioning. We want the mountain, and we want to reject the traffic.
But according to this framework, that hierarchy is a complete illusion. The supreme stress of your commute and the profound bliss of the meditation retreat are entirely ontologically equal.
They are equally empty.
They are equally dependently co-arisen, and therefore they are equally perfect in their suchness. The traffic jam is just as much a manifestation of the ultimate reality as the sunset.
Yes. There's not the slightest bit of difference between the extreme limit of samsara and the extreme limit of nirvana. A beggar and a king, a traffic jam and a sunset are completely equal in their emptiness.
That is a radically democratic view of reality.
It is. But it's vital to understand that realizing this requires a profound cognitive surrender. We transcend all the maps by seeing entirely through them, but, and this is key, without nihilistically throwing them away.
We don't burn the map, we just stop worshiping it. Because if we burn the map, we can't drive the car.
Exactly. And this means we have to let go of even our most sacred philosophical vehicles.
It's an emptiness itself.
Especially emptiness. True freedom isn't discovering a superior map, like the doctrine of emptiness or the 12 lengths, and fiercely clinging to it as your new identity.
You can't become a fundamentalist of emptiness.
No, because then you are right back in the golden cage. True freedom means embodying the union of the two truths about the two truths themselves.
Which means?
You have to understand that the concepts of dependent origination and emptiness are themselves mutually dependent, co-arisen, and empty. They are just pedagogical tools. They are medicine.
And as the text beautifully implies, once a patient is cured of their disease, they don't just keep swallowing medicine for the rest of their life.
Right. That would make them sick again.
If you take the medicine of emptiness, and it cures your disease of grasping at solid reality, you don't keep chugging the medicine. You gracefully spit it out. You let the concept of emptiness go too.
Because if the war against illusory defilements ceases, you arrive at that state of suchness. You rest in the limitless flux of reality exactly as it is, perceiving all phenomena as primordially equal, pure, perfect, complete, and devoid of the subject-object split.
Okay, but this brings up a massive practical hurdle.
Yeah.
We need to talk about how this actually functions in a human life.
What do you mean?
Well, if the commute and the meditation retreat are equal, and there's nothing to seek, nothing to destroy, and nothing to purify, what does a liberated person actually do? Do they just sit on the couch and stare at the wall, completely apathetic to the world?
Oh, I see.
I mean, if it's all an empty mirage, why bother doing anything at all? Why care about injustice or poverty or climate change?
That is the ultimate pitfall of misunderstanding emptiness. Detached, privileged apathy, and the source explicitly rejects it.
Oh, good.
Operationally, transcending the map translates to what the text calls acting without acting.
Acting without acting.
The practitioner emphatically does not sit on the couch. They still chop wood, they still carry water, they still passionately advocate for justice in society. They still utilize conventional maps of ethics, morality, and causality.
But how? How do you fight for justice if you truly, deeply know that the oppressor and the oppressed are both fundamentally empty, dependently co-arisen, and illusory? Doesn't the knowledge of emptiness drain your motivation?
Not if you understand the two truths. You engage completely, but you do it without apprehension, without reification, and without the agonizing, teeth-gritting effort of trying to force reality to conform to a rigid, dualistic narrative.
It reminds me of the psychology of playing a really intense board game.
A board game.
Yeah, let's say you were playing a complex game of chess, or maybe Settlers of Catan, with a group of friends.
Okay, sure.
While you were playing, you engage with immense passion. You follow the rules, you strategize, you feel the thrill of a good move and the sting of a mistake. You utilize the conventional maps of the game to play it ethically and well.
But you know it's a game.
Exactly. You do all of this entirely free from the agonizing delusion that the cardboard pieces possess absolute inherent reality. You don't think the little plastic knight is actually going to bleed when it gets captured.
Right.
You can play the game with incredible precision, but your identity isn't shattered when the game ends because you always knew you were playing a game.
That framework applies perfectly to acting without acting. You engage fully with the conventional world's maps to relieve suffering, because conventionally suffering is very real.
The sweat from the nightmare is real.
Exactly. But you are completely free from the toxic fuel of ego, of self-righteous crusading, or rigid attachment to the outcome.
That phrase, self-righteous crusading, is so important. I mean, so much of what we call fighting for good in our society is entirely dependent on having an inherently evil enemy to destroy.
Yeah.
We love the narrative of the righteous hero slaughtering the wicked villain. It feels good. It inflates the ego.
But if you understand emptiness, you understand that the villain is not inherently evil. There is no core of pure darkness inside them. They are a dependently co-arisen bundle of conditions, traumas, ignorances, and circumstances.
Which means we need to talk about the mechanism of how we catch this in real time. Let's go back to the 12 links of dependent origination.
Let's do it.
Say tomorrow, my boss yells at me unfairly. The conventional reality is that it hurts. The contact creates a negative feeling. My prapanyaka, my conceptual proliferation, immediately wants to jump to craving, to grasping, to reifying my boss as an inherently evil enemy.
Right, that's the habit.
So how do I functionally stop that in the moment before I start a self-righteous crusade?
The mechanism of stopping prapanyaka is mindfulness applied to the space between feeling and craving in those 12 links.
Between feeling and craving.
When the boss yells, the sound waves hit your ear. That's contact. The nervous system reacts with an unpleasant sensation. That's feeling. In an untrained mind, feeling instantly triggers craving. The craving to retaliate, to defend the self. But if you have internalized the tetralemma, if you realize the self being attacked doesn't inherently exist, you can pause at feeling.
So I just observed the physiological reality of the unpleasantness. My heart is beating fast. My face is flushed.
Exactly. You experience the suchness of the moment without adding the conceptual map of, I am a victim and he is a villain. You realize the anger is an echo. It is there, yet not there.
And when you refuse to feed the anger with concepts, the links break.
Yes, the 12 links break at that point. Becoming and birth of a new cycle of suffering do not occur.
And when you break that cycle, what replaces it? Because it can't just be a blank, emotionless void.
It isn't a void at all. The source states that when the logical delusion of a separate, inherent self is entirely destroyed, what emerges is the spontaneous arising of boundless compassion.
Compassion is the default state.
Yes. When the artificial, reified boundaries between self and other evaporate, the entire dynamic of how you interact with the world shifts. The text uses an incredible analogy of an immune system.
Walk us through that. How is compassion like an immune system?
It says that alleviating the suffering of another becomes as natural, spontaneous, and unobstructed as the body's immune system rushing to heal a cut on a finger.
Oh, wow.
Think about it. When you accidentally slice your finger with a kitchen knife, your body doesn't pause to deliberate. Your white blood cells don't form a committee to decide if the finger deserves to be healed.
Right, they just go.
The rest of your body doesn't view the finger as some external object that it must go save out of a sense of moral superiority.
The body just heals the web, because the finger is not other. It is part of the same interdependent system.
Exactly. The finger doesn't crusade, it just heals. True compassion isn't a heavy moral obligation you force yourself to perform. It becomes the effortless default state of a liberated mind.
That is just beautiful.
You act fully in the world to relieve suffering, but you are never shattered or burned out by it because the battle was never reified in the first place.
That is a staggering vision of what a human being can be. So what does this all mean for us? For you listening on your own spiritual, professional, or intellectual journey, trying to make sense of all these maps and concepts.
I think it means putting down the burden.
Exactly. It means that the exhaustingly heavy backpack we've been carrying our whole lives, the one filled with our need to become pure, our desperate need to destroy our ignorance, our need to reach a finish line called enlightenment, we can just put it down.
We don't need to assassinate our inherently real ignorance to acquire wisdom. We just have to wake up from the nightmare.
We wake up, the physiological terror stops, and we simply engage with the beautiful, fluid, interdependent web of reality exactly as it is, without demanding it fit inside our tiny, rigid little boxes.
That's the essence of it.
Let's take a breath and recap this immense journey. We started by looking at how our minds compulsively act like butchers, chopping up a fluid cosmos into rigid three-sphere subjects, actions, and objects.
And we applied the relentless logic of the tetralemma to prove that these boundaries, including our own separate selves, don't inherently exist. They fail at being identical, different, both, or neither.
We explored the vital importance of not turning that lack of inherent existence into a new golden cage of emptiness, but instead understanding reality as a web of dependent origination.
We saw how the ultimate truth of emptiness and the conventional truth of daily life are a perfect union, explaining how our everyday nightmares can cause real biological sweat, even if the monsters are just structural phantoms.
We watched the ontological hierarchy of the entire universe collapse, revealing that the stress of a morning commute and the bliss of deep meditation are perfectly equal in their empty suchness.
And finally, we saw how putting down our linguistic maps doesn't lead to apathetic couch-sitting, but to a life of acting without acting, catching our mental proliferation in real time, playing the board game of life with passion and precision, and allowing a spontaneous, effortless compassion to emerge that heals the world exactly the way an immune system heals a body.
It is a complete paradigm shift, a total transcendence without rejection.
And I want to gently remind everyone listening, all the sources, articles, research, and deep dives you consume, including this one, they are incredibly useful maps. They are wonderful medicine.
But don't eat the menu.
Right. The profound invitation of Nāgārjuna is to remember to occasionally put the map down, spit out the medicine, and simply look at the territory. Stop conceptualizing reality and just experience its suchness.
I love that. And to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. If nirvana isn't a destination you have to sweat and bleed to reach, but is simply the act of putting down your mental maps, what happens to that ultimate goal or that perfectly pure version of yourself you've been so exhaustingly striving for the moment you realize you're already standing on the finish line? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring the territory, keep questioning the maps, and we will catch you next time.